Karoline Leavitt said, "You're not a real country." TRAORÉ'S calm reply changed the internet. It was a Tuesday night in New York City. The lights inside the Midtown broadcast studio were low but focused. Cameras hummed. Microphones blinked red. The countdown clock on the wall ticked closer to 0. 3 chairs faced each other under soft studio lighting. One for the host, one for the sharp-tongued political commentator, Karoline Leavitt, and one for a man most Americans had never heard of before tonight, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, interim president of Burkina Faso. Across the country, millions tuned in. Some expected fireworks, others expected the usual talking points. Most didn't know what to expect. The show's introduction rolled. Patriotic music, a sweeping graphic of the American flag. The host, a familiar face from primetime news, welcomed the audience. "Tonight," he said, "we talk about Africa, more specifically, America's role in West Africa. And to help us do that, we welcome Captain Ibrahim Traoré." He turned to his left, gesturing toward the calm figure in a dark blue suit. Traoré nodded, once his expression still and watchful. Karoline Leavitt sat to the host's right, former press secretary, known for her rapid-fire rebuttals and crisp one-liners. Her fans loved her for her edge. Her critics called her condescending. Either way, she had never backed down from a debate. The set was designed for confrontation, a circular table with no barriers. Overhead lights cast soft shadows, but the center remained lit, no hiding, no filters. Just words, faces, and eyes. The conversation began simply enough. "Captain Traoré," the host asked, "what is your message to Americans who question why the U.S. should be involved in Africa at all?" Traoré's voice was soft but steady. His accent was slight, his rhythm deliberate. He spoke of history, of extraction and foreign influence, of promises made and promises broken. He did not accuse, he did not blame. He laid out facts with care. "When you invest in our roads," he said, "our children go to school. When you build clinics, our mothers survive childbirth. But when support comes with conditions that silence our voice, that's no longer partnership, that's control." He continued, his hands folded in his lap. "Africa does not ask for pity. We ask for fairness, equal footing, dignity." The audience back home listened. Some nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. Karoline Leavitt waited. She let him finish, then leaned forward, a smile on her lips. "Captain," she said, drawing out the title slightly, "with all due respect, if your country is struggling with corruption, conflict, and weak infrastructure, isn't it fair for the U.S. to attach strings to its aid? We don't want to throw money into a broken system." The words were delivered smoothly, like a lawyer reading from a script. But underneath was something sharper. Traoré looked at her, not startled, not offended, just steady. "And do you attach strings to Europe?" he asked. There was a pause. "Let's not pretend there are no double standards," he added. The host glanced between them, sensing the tension rising. But the segment moved forward. They discussed mineral rights, military bases, educational exchange. Nothing too sharp. Traoré remained poised, unflinching. He mentioned young engineers returning home, African universities, rising in global rankings, partnerships with Asian countries that offered respect instead of rhetoric. Karoline countered with statistics about foreign aid misuse. Her tone remained professional, but her words suggested something else, condescension wrapped in courtesy. The host tried to balance it out. He shifted the topic to regional stability and counterterrorism. Traoré answered with clarity. "Security does not come from soldiers, it comes from jobs, from hope, from justice." The camera zoomed in as he spoke. No notes, no script, just lived experience. The audience remained quiet, observant, curious. Every word was being measured, every gesture watched. Karoline tapped her fingers on the table, once, twice. Her rhythm impatient, her smile faint but fixed. The lighting technician adjusted the brightness. The control room director whispered, "Stay tight," on Traoré. A murmur passed through the production crew. Not panic, but a shift. Something about his presence had stilled the air. In homes across America, people sat forward. In bars, the volume went up. In living rooms, remote controls paused mid-scroll. No one knew it yet, but something was building. and the silence that followed it would not last forever. The studio came back from commercial with a polished transition. The camera zoomed wide, revealing the full set again. The host smiled into the lens papers shuffling in his hands, his voice smooth. "Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Captain Ibrahim Traoré, interim president of Burkina Faso, and political analyst Karoline Leavitt. The conversation so far illuminating." He turned toward Karoline. "Karoline, you had a follow-up." She nodded, smiled thinly, then turned to Traoré. "You've spoken a lot about dignity and partnership," she said. "But I think many Americans watching at home want to know if partnership is the goal. Where is the accountability? How do we ensure aid doesn't vanish into private hands or fund instability?" She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. Her tone was sharp-pointed calm, the type that drew lines without raising volume. Traoré didn't blink. "Accountability is not a privilege of the powerful," he said. "It's a universal principle. When we speak of corruption, let us speak of it everywhere it exists." The host shifted in his chair. The air felt a degree heavier. Karoline leaned in, elbows on the desk now. "Captain, you come from a region with coups, child soldiers, and collapsed infrastructure. How do you expect Americans to see your leadership as credible?" A subtle shift, not just a question, a statement woven into inquiry. Traoré rested his hands on the table. "Because leadership is not defined by where one begins. It is revealed by what one endures." A beat of silence. The host glanced at the monitor, checking the clock. The segment was long, but he didn't dare cut it short. Traoré continued, "In my country, power is not passed through legacy or money. It is tested by fire. You do not lead unless you have bled for something beyond yourself." His voice didn't rise. His words, steady and measured, hit harder because of it. Karoline inhaled sharply, but recovered. "Would you say then that criticism from the West is invalid?" "No," he replied, "but I question its consistency." The studio light flickered briefly, a subtle technical hiccup, enough to notice. The moment passed, but the tension didn't. Then she said it, quietly, like a throwaway line meant to slip beneath the radar. "Well, I suppose some nations are more symbolic than sovereign," Karoline said, smiling without humor. It wasn't loud, but it was precise, and every person in the room heard it. The host stiffened. A producer in the control room dropped their pen. A sound tech stopped mid-adjustment. Traoré did not move. The words sat in the air, sharp and cold. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable. Then slowly he reached into his lap and adjusted a small pendant, a worn piece of wood, smooth with age. The host finally broke in. "Let's shift slightly. Captain Traoré, what do you envision for the future of your region?" Traoré turned his head slowly. His eyes didn't scan for approval. They locked in. A future where no child must trade innocence for survival. Where history isn't written only by those who arrived with flags and armies. Where sovereignty isn't an idea, it's a practice. Karoline's expression stiffened. Her jaw tightened. She was preparing something, a response, a pivot. But it never arrived. Because, in that moment, the studio door opened slightly too quiet for cameras, but enough to cause a pause. A crew member stepped in with a silent gesture. The control room director's voice crackled faintly in the host's earpiece. "Stay close on him. We're holding off the next guest. Let this breathe." The host gave the slightest nod, then looked into the camera. "This conversation isn't easy," he said, "but perhaps that's the point." He turned to Traoré. "You mentioned earlier the role of memory. Can you explain what that means to your leadership?" Traoré adjusted the small pendant still resting in his lap. "Memory is not nostalgia. It is responsibility. We carry more than pain, we carry the obligation not to forget." He placed the pendant gently on the table. The camera zoomed slightly, catching its worn surface in deep grooves. Karoline looked at it, then back at him. For the first time, her eyes darted not in anger, but calculation. "I don't know what that is," she said. Traoré met her gaze. "It belonged to my brother." No one spoke. The lights didn't move. The host didn't interject. The pendant stayed in the frame as if it had taken on weight, not symbolic weight, real emotional gravity. The clock ticked louder now, or maybe it only seemed that way. Karoline sat straighter. Her smile returned, but it had edges now. "Well," she said, "I suppose everyone brings something to the table." Traoré didn't answer. His silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate, contained. The host cleared his throat. Let's go to audience questions after the break. The screen faded again, but the camera held longer than usual. Long enough for viewers to see that not everything said tonight was spoken aloud. What lingered was not a soundbite, not a headline. It was something quieter, and far more difficult to ignore. The studio lights dimmed only slightly during the break, just enough for a quiet reset. Crew members moved silently around the perimeter. The audience remained seated, unusually quiet. The air in the room didn't relax, it thickened. A few producers whispered to one another in the control booth. Do we cut the next segment? No, we stay with this. They all knew something had changed, though no one could quite name it. Not yet. The screen flicked back to life. The host sat straighter now, his voice less rehearsed. We're back, he said, his tone softer. And we've received more questions than usual for this segment. Captain Traoré, would you mind if we took a few from the audience? Traoré nodded once, of course. The host gestured toward a young woman in the third row. She stood slowly, clutching a notepad. Her voice was careful. My question is for Captain Traoré, she said. You speak about history and dignity. But what does that mean, practically? For people in America, what should we take away from what you're saying? Traoré looked at her. That dignity is not owned by any nation. It is something every person has the right to stand in, even when the world suggests otherwise. The woman nodded and sat. There was no applause, just a thoughtful stillness. A second hand went up, a man older, perhaps a veteran by his bearing. Captain, he said, do you think Americans understand the burden you carry? No, Traoré replied simply, but I do not expect them to. Only that they not look away when it is finally visible. The room felt smaller now, not cramped, just closer, as if everyone had moved an inch toward one another without realizing. Karoline shifted slightly in her seat, her arms crossed. The host asked gently, Karoline, would you like to respond? She nodded once. I think what we're seeing here is a lot of emotion. And while I respect personal stories, policy must be built on outcomes, not sentiment. It was carefully worded, neutral in tone, but something about it landed flat. Traoré did not react. Instead, he turned toward the host. May I share something personal? The host gestured. Of course. Traoré adjusted the mic in front of him. He did not raise his voice, but something in his posture straightened. When I was 17, he began, I crossed 5 provinces on foot to warn a neighboring village of a militia attack. I did not have a weapon, only a map and a note from my commander. That note saved lives, but I did not return home. A quiet inhalation spread across the audience. I returned to Ash. He paused. My father had stayed behind. My mother survived only because she had walked 3 miles to fetch water. When she came back, everything was gone. Karoline didn't move, but her eyes lowered for the first time. I do not say this for sympathy, Traoré continued. I say it because when people ask me why I lead it, is not because I wanted to. It is because there was no one else left. The camera slowly pushed in. No cuts, no transitions, just presence. In that moment, standing in rubble, I made a promise. That I would not be the last voice from that village. That we would not be forgotten. Silence. He placed the pendant on the table again, closer to the camera this time. This was carved by my brother, before he disappeared. No one asked what had happened to him. They didn't need to. The host cleared his throat, but even his practiced professionalism trembled. We have time for one more, he said. A young boy no older than 10 stood in the front row. He didn't have a microphone, but his voice, though soft, carried. Do you miss your family? The question was not scripted, not filtered through advisors or teleprompters. It came from a child. Traoré looked at him, his face unchanged. Every day. The boy nodded and sat. Karoline opened her mouth, perhaps to offer a final rebuttal, but the host interjected. I think he said slowly, we're going to take another break. As the screen faded again, the control room didn't say a word. The director leaned back, removed her headset and whispered, let it breathe. The air had changed, not just in the studio, but in the way people might talk the next morning in living rooms, classrooms, waiting rooms. Something had pierced the surface, and no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. Not anymore. The break was longer this time, not for commercials, not for segments, just time unspoken and necessary. The studio didn't buzz. It settled. Not a single audience member left their seat. Even the crew stayed still, as if moving might interrupt something sacred. The lights rose again slowly, not for effect, just continuity. The host spoke with less rhythm, more breath. We return now to a conversation that has moved beyond format. Captain Traoré, thank you for what you've shared. Traoré gave a nod, slight but certain. The pendant still rested before him. Karoline Leavitt hadn't left her seat either, but she had shifted, not defensively, not openly combative, but changed, if only in posture. The host looked toward her. You've spent your career in political commentary. What are you thinking right now? Karoline hesitated for the first time that night. She clasped her hands together on the desk, not tightly, not loosely, just enough to steady herself. I think, she said slowly, that sometimes we come to a table thinking we know the script, and then someone speaks and the script burns. The audience didn't clap. They didn't need to. The host turned to Traoré. Captain, if there is one thing you wish Americans could feel, not just understand but feel about your journey, what would it be? Traoré was silent for a moment. Then, to feel the ache of being unseen, and to feel what it's like when someone finally looks, really looks, and doesn't flinch. The host leaned back. No follow-up came. Another hand rose from the audience, a middle-aged woman. Her voice was steady but not rehearsed. My son was stationed in Africa. He died in uniform. He always said the people there, they taught him more than the training ever did. She looked directly at Traoré. I just wanted to say, thank you. Traoré bowed his head. Then it is I who thank him. The woman sat down slowly. The studio was still. Karoline spoke again, more softly now. I've worked in policy for years. I've been trained to challenge, to question. But I didn't come tonight prepared for this kind of truth. Traoré didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply replied, truth does not prepare itself either. It just arrives. From the corner of the room, a production assistant signaled for a timing check. The host ignored it. He leaned forward. Captain, earlier you mentioned your brother. If he were watching now, what would you want him to hear? Traoré looked down at the pendant. His fingers touched its edge. That I kept the promise. Nothing else. A tear traced down someone's cheek in the front row. Whether it was joy, grief, or recognition didn't matter. The host sat back. No words came. The studio lights dimmed slightly, not to end the segment, but to honor it. There was no outro music. No applause sign lit up. No one reached for their phones, and the pendant stayed exactly where it had been set, in full view, visible. A few minutes passed without anyone officially dismissing the room. The cameras stayed trained on the set, waiting for the signal that never came. Viewers at home were treated to an unusual sight silence, a silence that wasn't awkward but absolute. Finally, a voice from the audience, older, weary, and yet clear. My grandfather was from Benin. He came to the U.S. in the 1960s. He told us we'd never be seen until we refused to disappear. Captain, tonight you reminded me of him. No camera turned to capture the man's face, only his words, and for once that was enough. Traoré nodded slowly. Another voice chimed in, a younger woman, her voice cracking at the edges. My students always ask me if leadership is real anymore. I never had an answer. I think maybe tonight I do. In the control room, the director whispered, keep the feed open. On the floor, a stagehand lowered his headset and stepped aside, arms folded across his chest. People weren't just responding, they were remembering. Not just something they'd heard, but something they'd once known and forgotten. The weight in the room was no longer on one man. It had moved, distributed, absorbed. Truth, it seemed, was no longer being spoken by one voice. It was being held by many. And even then it wasn't finished. A teenager in the back row stood up. He had no microphone, but his voice rose with steady courage. I've been ashamed of my heritage, he admitted, because I thought silence was safer. But you spoke tonight, and I think I want to speak too. The room didn't applaud, it breathed. That breath, the first collective breath in what felt like an hour, was fuller, deeper, as though something clenched had been released. The host blinked rapidly, unaccustomed to losing the tempo of his own program. But he didn't try to reclaim it. He let it go. Captain, he said softly, this has become something larger than any of us expected. Traoré nodded once. It always was. We just didn't see it. and still the cameras rolled. The studio, though unchanged in appearance, had transformed. The set was the same, the lighting no different, but something deeper had shifted. The silence lingered, not as a pause, but as a presence. It wrapped around each person like a warm fog. Dense, quiet, undeniable. The cameras still rolled. There had been no cue from the director, no signal to reset. The moment wasn't over. It refused to be. Traoré's hands remained folded. The pendant remained on the table, its worn wood gleaming softly beneath the overhead lights. The symbol of something no caption could summarize. The host finally spoke, not with authority, but with uncertainty. "We're still here, so perhaps we stay with this." No one objected. Even Karoline Leavitt, who once dominated panels with her precision, now sat differently. Her hands were in her lap, her eyes no longer sharp but softened, searching. A voice from off-camera cleared their throat. Then another question, not from the planned cards, not from production notes. A man's voice, deep and hesitant. "What gives you hope, Captain?" Traoré didn't turn. He didn't need to. He let the question land fully before answering. "Hope," he said slowly, "is not born in comfort. It is born when something breaks and you decide to rebuild it anyway." He paused. "What gives me hope is that people still ask, even now." A long breath was exhaled by someone off camera. Karoline, perhaps needing to recover a fragment of her role, leaned slightly forward. "Do you think systems can change?" she asked. Traoré met her gaze directly. "Only when the people within them believe the cost of staying the same is greater than the fear of changing." No retort came. A young man in a service uniform raised his hand from the third row. The camera caught him clearly, his posture, straight eyes, locked onto Traoré. "I served in Mali," he said. "I saw things, some good, some bad. But what I saw most was dignity, even in places the world never looks. What would you say to the men I served beside?" Traoré's voice didn't waver, that they stood on sacred ground, and that no act of service goes unseen, not by the land, not by its people. The soldier gave a slow nod. The host shifted forward. "Captain, in all this, have you ever felt alone?" There was no hesitation. "Every day." He lifted the pendant briefly, then set it back down. "But aloneness is not absence. It is a reminder that what we carry must be shared or it will crush us." A pause, then another question, this time from the host, more personal. "Do you believe the world can listen without defending itself?" Traoré smiled gently. "Not always, but I believe it can learn to." The room was quieter now, not because it had grown solemn, but because it had found a new rhythm. Not one of confrontation, but of understanding. A producer gestured silently to the host, 5 minutes remaining. He nodded, but didn't speak to the camera. Instead, he addressed the studio. "I want to do something we've never done before," he said. "If anyone here has something they want to share, one sentence, stand up. Say it. This is your space, too." There was a beat. Then a woman in a maintenance uniform stood. "I lost a brother in Liberia. I never talked about it. I think maybe now I will." A man near the back: "I teach debate. I'm going to change how I teach it." A soft voice from a teenager: "I think I want to write again." It continued, one sentence at a time. Each a fragment, each a wound, each a decision. And through it all, Traoré listened. Not with stillness, but with presence. By the time the host spoke again, no one noticed the clock had run over. No one mentioned programming schedules or segments lost. He looked into the camera, then back at Traoré. "There are moments in television you can't plan. This was one of them." He paused. "Captain, thank you." Traoré nodded. "Thank you for staying." The screen didn't fade immediately. It held as if the moment itself refused to be boxed or reduced. And when it finally did go black, it did so gently. Not with an ending, but with an echo. In the days that followed, the segment aired again, first on demand, then on late-night reruns, and finally as a topic of serious commentary. Analysts discussed it. Professors assigned it. People didn't just quote it, they paused when they did. Not out of reverence, but recognition. Clips spread online, but they weren't overproduced. No background music, no captions screaming for clicks. Just moments the pendant, the boys questioned the silence. Someone began tagging them with "seen at last." It caught on, quietly, like truth does. And far from the studio across oceans and time zones in a small village in West Africa, a mother who had never owned a television saw her son's face for the first time in years projected through the phone of a neighbor. She touched the screen. "I see you," she whispered. The dust hadn't settled, not really. What happened in that studio didn't just make ripples, it altered tides. In newsrooms across the country, editorial meetings opened with a question that had rarely surfaced with sincerity. What does this story ask of us? Networks scrambled not to replicate the moment, but to understand it. Analysts tried to dissect it. What made it land? Was it the silences, the pendant, the restraint? But no answer felt complete because the power of what happened couldn't be measured in engagement metrics or audience retention curves. It was something older, something truer, and yet despite the waves it created, Ibrahim Traoré did not speak to the media in the days that followed. He gave no interviews, released no statements. He returned to his duties quietly, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But across West Africa something changed. In classrooms, teachers played the segment and paused to ask, "What did you feel here?" In government offices, staffers who had long grown numb to rhetoric exchanged glances and quietly agreed, "This is what representation can look like." At embassies, diplomats forwarded the clip not as propaganda but as proof that a different kind of diplomacy was possible. And in living rooms across the globe, families replayed it. Parents showed it to children. Children watched it more than once. In a rural hospital in northern Ghana, a nurse named Mariama paused in the hallway to replay a clip on her phone. Around her, other nurses gathered. "She speaks like our grandfather did," one said. "No," Mariama replied. "He speaks like someone who listened to our grandfathers." Back in New York, the host received a letter. It was handwritten. No return address. It read, "I didn't believe people could change on live television. You proved me wrong. Thank you for not interrupting." He kept the letter in his desk. Karoline Leavitt, too, was changed not in public appearances, but in private moments. She started listening more in meetings. She asked fewer questions with sharp barbs at the end. She even wrote a piece, not a rebuttal, not a defense, but a reflection. She called it "The Night the Room Got Quiet." It was picked up by several outlets, but the comments that followed weren't about her. They were about him, about a man who walked into a studio prepared not to win an argument but to carry a promise. And perhaps most telling of all were the viewers who didn't watch the segment live, but heard about it later. They came not for the spectacle, but for the stillness, because there was something magnetic about seeing a man speak without performance, speak with burden, speak with grace. One day, weeks later, a journalist finally caught up with Captain Traoré during a press conference in Accra. She asked, "Do you believe what happened that night changed anything?" He looked at her, not with surprise, not with pride, just clarity. "Change is not what happens when people agree with you," he said. "It's what happens when they remember what they are capable of." And then he walked away. The journalist didn't ask for more. She had enough. In Burkina Faso, a mural appeared in the capital. It wasn't commissioned. It simply was. Painted on the side of a crumbling school wall, it showed a man standing before a crowd, not on a podium, but eye level. In his hand, not a flag, but a carved wooden pendant. No signature, just 3 words beneath it. "We remember ourselves." And in that perhaps lay the final lesson that sometimes the most powerful moments are not the ones that seek to change the world, but the ones that quietly invite the world to remember itself.